AFN Television News, compiled from the major American networks, wire services, and public affairs offices.
Good evening. The foreign exchange fixings in the 10 European economic communities will be suspended tomorrow. That announcement made by the French finance minister immediately after ministers had suspended meetings in Brussels without reaching an agreement on the European monetary system. The French minister says the suspended fixings means there will be no interventions by the central banks to defend the currencies of the economic community. The announcement that the meeting had suspended followed reports that progress had been made on the French request that any devaluation of the franc be accompanied by a reevaluation of the West German mark. Finance ministers are expected to meet again tomorrow. In France, the economic situation is causing some political problems. Today, the French Foreign Trade Minister, Michel Joubert, resigned his post, saying that he could no longer continue so ill-defined a position. Back in the U.S., the president has money matters on his mind as well. In his weekly radio address, he blasted the budget proposed by the Democrats, saying that it gambles with America's safety and security. ABC's Ann Compton reports this comes just one day after Mr. Reagan called the proposal a dagger aimed at the heart of his economic policy.
President Reagan came armed to do battle before the news cameras, attacking as truly dangerous the budget proposed by liberal Democrats.
The so-called Jones proposal is a declaration of war against the common sense principles that are now rebuilding America. I'm not going to sit still for a proposal that makes a huge increase in taxes, guts our defense program, repeals many of the overdue welfare reforms that we have enacted, and adds an incredible $181 billion in domestic spending to what we've proposed.
The Democratic budget comes up with a slightly smaller deficit, but at the expense of the Pentagon spending that President Reagan says he's making progress in rebuilding.
Nothing could bring greater joy to the Kremlin than seeing the United States abandon its defense rebuilding program after barely 1 year.
Later, to the cheers of some business groups, Mr. Reagan flatly promised to veto any attempt to repeal his tax cuts, and again took aim at the Democrats' budget.
Such a plan not only would gamble with the security of the United States, it would plunge us once again into the no man's land of spend and spend and tax and tax. We must not permit them to drag us back into that swamp.
The stakes are high in this battle. President Reagan stands to lose on defense spending and on the prospects for a strong economic recovery. Since the president no longer enjoys bipartisan strength on budget issues in the House, aides say he's considering a prime-time Oval Office address on defense to build support before next week's budget vote in the House. Ann Compton, ABC News, the White House.
Missouri Congressman Richard Gebhardt gave the Democratic response to the president's address, saying that his party's plan will keep America strong without leaving it economically drained. Gebhardt questioned the president's big defense expenditures and enormous deficits. One aspect of the president's proposal that has come under attack is the extra $110 million in aid going to El Salvador. ABC's Peter Collins takes a look at the American role in that country.
The instructor is a Salvadoran sergeant. The guy in the back is an American sergeant watching closely. He is grading the teacher. Showing the Salvadorans how to instruct their own people is what most of the 50 or so American military men here do. They call that an attention getter. After these Salvadoran sergeants and lieutenants leave here, they will be able to use these American-made recoilless rifles in combat and show other soldiers how to do it as well. It's also a matter of changing the ideas of soldiers who've been used to staying in their barracks and supporting right-wing military regimes.
I'm not saying that they're all Jeffersonian Democrats, but they've come a long way. They understand that the name of the game is popular support, and without it, they can't win.
Out of the $110 million in proposed emergency military aid for El Salvador, 1 out of 5 would go toward doubling the number of American-trained soldiers. The rest would go for ammunition and hardware. Colonel Wagelstein believes the emphasis should be put on training, even if that means more Americans in El Salvador.
Obviously, we could use more trainers, but that's a policy decision that I'm just going to let folks in Washington sort out. They tell me how many people I got to do the job, and that's what we'll go with.
The acid test of training is performance in combat, and so far the 3 American-trained battalions have done generally well. An example, men of the U.S.-trained Atonal Battalion on patrol. They keep their distance, move alertly, handle their guns and equipment well. The contrast with untrained garrison units is unmistakable. So, how many better trained soldiers will it take to win the war? That depends on the response of the guerrillas, and their training has also improved. Peter Collins, ABC News, El Salvador.
Reports in today's London Times say that President Reagan sees a strong possibility of a meeting with Soviet leader Yuri Andropov before the year ends. The report quotes the president as saying that such a meeting would have to do more than just allow the leaders to get acquainted. Mr. Reagan did not comment in the report on conditions or plans for such a meeting. Meanwhile, Defense Secretary Caspar Weinberger is heading to Europe for talks with NATO allies on the deployment of new U.S. missiles. Deputy Secretary of State Kenneth Dam is also heading to Europe. He'll visit Norway, Denmark, and West Germany this week during a 10-day visit to the continent. Eastern Airlines representatives and officials of the Machinists Union will be meeting in Washington tomorrow with federal mediators to try to head off a threatened Thursday strike. Last night, union members overwhelmingly rejected a tentative pact with the airlines. And with spring almost here, a young panda's fancy turns to thoughts of romance. After 8 years of trying, officials at the National Zoo in Washington report that their 2 giant pandas may soon become parents. The pandas, gifts from the Republic of China, have successfully made it in full view of television cameras. But just to make sure, officials are going to artificially inseminate Ling Ling in hopes of a rare captivity-born panda being created. AFN Television News will continue with sports and weather coming up next.
If you're planning to visit other countries during your tour in Germany, there are a few things you'll need. You'll need a passport or a valid ID card and maybe a visa. If you're active duty military, you'll need an official leave authorization. And depending on where you're going, you may need flag orders. Traveler's checks are a good idea. And of course, you'll want to take along an extra supply of medications. Read up on the country you'll be visiting. For more information, contact your personnel office or the nearest U.S. consulate. Plan ahead and have a good trip.
Coming to AFN's Movie of the Week.
Since you're so set on having an honest game, that blue-eyed killer back there is a known associate of Mr. Bass. They got more signals than the Southern Pacific. I don't want him standing behind me.
After all the rich pots you've won over the years, you're still a gambler. If I were your age, I'd invest my next big killing in a new way of life.
That's Brett Maverick, AFN's Movie of the Week, this coming Wednesday at 8:20.
For UCLA, the dream is over. The Bruins, who had a team they felt could go all the way this year, were upset in their West Regional Youth NCAA quarterfinal by the team with the worst record in this year's tournament. After surprising Illinois on Thursday, Utah yesterday sent the Bruins home with a 67-61 win. That victory upped the Utes' record to 18-13. And sent them into the West semifinals on Thursday night. For a rundown of the rest of the NCAA action, here's PFC Ron Bruschi.
Conference's top 2 teams have made the final 16 in the tourney. In a West Regional matchup, Ralph Sampson's 15 points, 12 rebounds, and 4 block shots led Virginia past Washington State 54-49. And the Tar Heels rolled past James Madison 68-49. Also in the East, a James Banks jumper with 2 seconds left lifted Georgia past Virginia Commonwealth 56-54. In the Midwest, Villanova nearly blew a 15-point lead in the final minutes, but held on to nudge Lamar 60-58. And the top-ranked Cougars fell their 23rd victim in a row by dumping Maryland 60-50. In the Mideast, Kentucky ripped Ohio 57-40 behind Dirk Minifield's 16 points, and Arkansas stole the ball 12 times from Purdue while dumping the Boilermakers 78-68. The action moves to AFN Radio tonight for 2 key matchups. Beginning at 7:05, the Hoyas of Georgetown take on Memphis State in a Midwest regional game. And at 9:30, Oklahoma takes on the Indiana Hoosiers in Mideast action. That's how things stand in the NCAA. PFC Ron Bruschi, AFN Sports.
A pair of free throws by Steve Yetman won the NAIA championship for Charleston last night as the Cougars held off West Virginia Wesleyan 57-53. Kelly Litch scored 25 as Southwestern State of Oklahoma won the women's NAIA title by beating Alabama Huntsville 80-68. In NCAA Division III women's basketball, it was North Central of Illinois over Elizabethtown, Pennsylvania, 83-71 for the title. And New Orleans topped Memphis State 68-58 for the NIT Women's Championship. In the NBA last night, the Iceman had a bit of a chill. George Gervin played 3 of his 4 quarters without scoring a point, but managed a few, 22 points worth in the third quarter, as the Spurs buried the hapless Indiana Pacers 138-118. The Pacers have now lost 15 of their last 16 games. With the rest of the NBA rundown, here's specialist Kathleen Devine.
Dan Roundfield scored 27 and grabbed 16 rebounds to lead the Hawks past Utah 99-94. The Lakers played without Magic Johnson, and it showed as the Clippers pounded the Lakers 107-99. Magic sat out with a bruised thigh muscle, and there's no word as to when he'll return. And the Suns held off Dallas in overtime 115-112. Moses Malone had 31 as the 76ers downed the Bucks 105-97, and finally the Bullets broke the Knicks' 8-game winning streak 96-90. Specialist Kathleen Devine, AFN Sports.
In the NHL, a couple of rookies scored their first career hat tricks last night. Defenseman Hannu Virta tallied 3 goals as Buffalo surprised Montreal 6-4. And Mats Holland scored his first hat trick and his 25th birthday yesterday as the Islanders whipped the Flyers 9-2. In other games, Boston and Calgary skated to a 2-2 tie. Edmonton outslugged Detroit 9-7. St. Louis and Minnesota had the Blues deadlocked at 3-all. The Penguins drilled L.A. 7-4 as goalie Michel Dion stopped 48 shots. The USFL's third weekend opened with some impressive offense as Jim Asmus drilled field goals of 47 and 57 yards as the Arizona Wranglers beat the L.A. Express 21-14. In a wild one, the Oakland Invaders outscored the Michigan Panthers 33-27. Fred Bisana carried Oakland on his arm, throwing for 338 yards and 2 touchdowns, while Michigan quarterback Bobby Hebert, not to be outdone, threw a trio of scoring strikes to wide receiver Derek Holloway. There's been no welterweight boxing champion since Sugar Ray Leonard retired last year. That was to change yesterday when Welshman Colin Jones and American Milton McCrory entered the ring in Reno, Nevada. It didn't. When they left the ring after 12 bloody rounds, one judge ruled the fight a draw, while 2 others had split decisions. WBC president said the 2 will try again after at least a 45-day resting period. The Central European forecast for tonight will be a little less beautiful than today. The European Forecast Unit in Kaiserslautern is calling for increasing cloudiness with rain and drizzle beginning around midnight. Overnight lows should be in the 40s. In London, the story of an American legend has been put to music and put on stage. ABC's Mike Lee reports the magic of Marilyn lives on.
Even James Bond superstar Roger Moore was drawn along with the Marilyn groupies to watch the first ever musical about the orphan named Norma Jean Baker, who changed her name, her nose, her hair, and her husband's to become Marilyn Monroe.
That's why I'm using the bleach. That's why I'm wetting my lips.
21 years after her lonely drug overdose death in Hollywood at the age of 36, and after numerous attempts in books and in films to recreate her appeal and despair, Marilyn has come alive on a London stage. In an American-financed $1 million production hoping for transplant to Broadway, British actress Stephanie Lawrence has treated herself to French fries and has tortured herself with barbells to try and measure up to a legend.
Marilyn Monroe.
The musical itself premiered to warm applause and to mixed reviews, but even the critics agree that the worldwide fascination with Marilyn Monroe, however accurate or distorted, has flourished, not faded. Mike Lee, ABC News, London.
I only hope I look that good 20 years from now. Coming up next on AFN's Service Spotlight, followed by the wonderful world of Disney. That's our Sunday evening edition of AFN Television News, where everyone here have a good evening and a good week. Good night.
AFN News is compiled from the major American networks, wire services, and public affairs offices.